May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord. The eyes of the Lord are upon the righteous, but who are the righteous? Throughout the three readings that we've had presented us today, there is an evolution of who the righteous are. The Hebrew exiles from Egypt in the story of Joshua believed that they were the righteous and had the right to kick anybody who was not them out of the land of, was it Canaan? Yeah, land of Canaan, through conquest and bloody murder. The letter to the Ephesians presented a very different presentation of righteousness. The Ephesians who were suffering under the rulership of Rome were the righteous, standing up for injustice, against injustice, made them the righteous from Paul's point of view. And Jesus, in his day and age, the righteous were the poor, the oppressed, the exploited of the temple in Jerusalem. And when he told those righteous people, I will lead you to Jerusalem, a few of them were like, well, that doesn't sound like a good time. Understandably. Standing up to injustice, standing up for righteousness, is not always the easiest thing to do. Sometimes in order to stand up for ourselves and to stand up for others, we are called to walk down a path that is extremely uncomfortable, like doing dental work on a dragon. And what Paul is trying to do in the letter of Ephesians, as an example, is to give those people standing up against injustice strength. He's trying to fortify their faith, let them know that they are doing something that is important and will make the world a better place, and that they're the ones that got to do it, because somebody has to do it. If you're not willing to stand up and speak out, can we rely on somebody else to do that for us? When we have this language, especially military language within the Bible, very often it's important for us to know why that's popping up. Who are these messages for? Who is the righteous? Because I think that a lot of this language gets misappropriated. A lot of us assume that the righteous that are being talked about are us, in whatever way or shape or form we are dealing with life. And sometimes it is. But it's important for us to understand that the book of Joshua, as a historical document, wasn't written for us. It's important for us to know that the letter of Ephesians literally was not written for us. Paul was writing to the Ephesians and somebody got his letter and we just happened to have it. It's important for us to also realize that the book of John, while it is something that we have, was not written for us. They were written to communicate an idea to a group of people. And that idea is a perspective on righteousness. If we understand what's happening in that conversation between the author and their intended audience, then maybe we can understand how their ideas of righteousness fit into our lives. Maybe then we can appropriate that, integrate it, bring it into our lives in a way that actually makes sense and is helpful. When we take it out of context, though, we often use these examples in ways that are not helpful. For instance, it's important to know that the book of Joshua, for some reason I was thinking Jeremiah. The book of Joshua, while it is a war history, isn't really a work of history. It's a work of fiction that the kingdoms of Israel made because all the other kingdoms around them had these awesome war histories. We should have one too. And if you look at the archaeological evidence of the time in which it's supposed to take place, you see that actually the Hebrew people probably didn't enter into that region in a way that was forceful or bloody or as some conquering army at all. Rather, it seems that the Hebrew culture, the Hebrew faith, integrated into that region as the people did. It was a commingling. Maybe it wasn't exactly peaceful, but it wasn't violent. And when you look at the way in which the Ephesians were struggling in their time, you can see that the way in which they were trying to stand up for justice also was not violent. A lot of these passages that speak about putting on armor, resisting arrows, standing up against evil, they are a way of communicating how the struggles of the world sometimes feel like we are in a battle. They are a way of communicating that sometimes we need to stand together in a way that feels like a Roman legion stood together. These were metaphors that people understood in that time. Those metaphors are not necessarily appropriate for this day and age. Nowadays, you have people taking up these passages and being like, geez, we should come up with some Jesus camp where we teach people to overthrow the government. And, that's not exactly what Jesus was going for when he told his disciples, I'm going to Jerusalem. He didn't plan on overturning the temple in a violent coup. He planned on showing the people of Israel that what the temple was doing was wrong, so that the temple had to address the injustices that they were inflicting upon people in Israel. They had to confront the way in which they were price gouging offerings in front of the temple steps. They had to confront the ways in which they were forcing people to, the way in which they were encouraging people to not pay attention to the poor, or people who were orphaned, or people who were born with disabilities. He was confronting the inequality of his era, and he was doing it in a way that brought out love. He was doing it in a way that vanquished evil by bringing people together. I think that when we read through these passages, or even when we sing these hymns, I'm marching to Zion, it's important for us to understand the conversation that we are listening in on. Because the conversation isn't directed at us. The conversation is for us. It's meant to teach us a lesson. That's the reason why it's in the Bible. But if we allow the message to be derailed, if we allow the message to be used outside of its intended purpose, you find yourself raising a Christian flag in front of the halls of Congress, screaming to hang Mike Pence. That's not the intention of these passages. These passages are meant to bring love into the world. These passages are meant to defeat evil. These passages are, the book of Jeremiah, and it's not Jeremiah, the book of Joshua was definitely a pointing fingers book. But Ephesians and John, John was meant to do that too. Let's stick with Ephesians. Paul was not trying to point the finger at people and say they're to blame. Paul was trying to say, look, we are a family, and we are supposed to come together. Paul wasn't always the best at that, but at least he had his heart in the right place. And I think that we need to try to understand where somebody like Paul is coming from. We need to understand where the author of John is coming from. We need to understand where the author of Joshua, yes, Joshua is coming from. I keep on mixing up my J's. Is it Jonah? Is it Jeremiah? Is it Joshua? We need to understand where those are coming from so that we can understand where this idea of righteousness fits into our lives. Because I don't agree with the definition of righteousness that Joshua, I don't agree with his definition of righteousness. I don't necessarily agree with the idea of righteousness as put forward in the book of John. I agree with Jesus' definition of righteousness, but I have 4 books in which I can sift that out. I, for the most part, agree with Paul's definition of righteousness. But they're different definitions. And we need to understand what our own definition of righteousness is if we really want to say that God is on the side